Okay, we're ready to begin this oral history with Alvar Green, otherwise known as Al Green. He's recording from his home in Tiburon, California. My name is Doug Fairbairn. I'm in Roseville, California, and we're recording this on June 10th, 2021, for the benefit of the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. Al, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. I understand it's not the most comfortable activity you might be involved in today, but I really do appreciate it, and the rest of us do as well. So in these oral histories, we would like to really not only talk about your professional life, but things leading up to that, things that laid the groundwork, how you came to be who you are. So if you could just give me a brief introduction to where and when you were born, a little bit about your early family life, what your father and mother did at the time. So we'll just sort of set the stage for what comes later.
Okay, if I go on too long, you can edit it out. Anyway, I was
too long in these.
I was born in a small country town in England by the name of Crowland, and it's about 20 miles from Cambridge. My parents, it's a farming community. My parents had upbringings that would pop right out of a Charles Dickens novel. It was pretty miserable. And my father was pulled out of school at 12 years old to support a family that didn't want him. And my mother came from an abusive family that sent her off into what they euphemistically called into service, which means you went to a rich person's house and did pretty much whatever they wanted to do, and they gave you a roof over their head and a stipend. So, moving along, these two met each other.
Oh, goodness, what an inauspicious beginning.
Yes, so these two met each other and had my oldest sister, Rita, in about the late 20s, had the next daughter, Betty, in the mid-30s. Along comes 1939, Germany invades Poland, England declares war. My father's sent off from 39 to 45, along with everybody else. My mother, who's left home with two young children, is now conscripted into what they used to call land girls. And they were basically sent off to work on farms to provide food to feed the country during the war. So now, fast forward to 1946, and I come along. We move.
Your sisters were 20 years older.
Yes, my oldest sister is 20 years older than me. The next one, the youngest of the two sisters, is 11 years older than me. So it was pretty much three families. You know, I mean, my sisters had left home before I really knew what was going on. My youngest sister left home at about 18, so I would have been 7 or 8 years old. Mm-hmm. So we then moved into what happened after the war. The government built all of this prefabricated housing to house the troops coming back from the war. Mm-hmm. And we went to live in one of these prefabricated housing estates, which they're called council houses. Now, council houses in England is basically, if you come from a council house, you are automatically pegged at the lower end of the rung. And I mean, you know, your chances of getting out of there are pretty slim. So, but it was actually a great childhood because all of the other people that were coming back from the war had children my age. So it was like an estate of, 15 cousins, and everybody was your parents. You know, if you did something wrong, somebody else's parents would tell you to get on the right track. So it was actually a pretty good childhood in as far as out in the country. You could go off and get into as much mischief as you like and come home when you liked, and it was pretty safe and pretty idyllic.
Just be home by dinner time.
Just be home by dinner time. So the education at that time was, it was just kind of not many steps out of Victorian era. So went off to a primary school. Once you finish that, then they send you off to a secondary modern school. And then they kind of jettison you out into, life. They don't really.
What was your father doing once he returned from the service?
Once he returned from the service, he worked for various people he knew who were landowners around there. So he worked on the farm, doing various things for various people. Also, some of his friends would have, he would drive lorries for people or buses for people. It was pretty much odd jobbing until about, when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Then he got a job at Perkins Engines. They're probably more famous today for making marine engines, but they were the largest employer around that area at that time in a town called Peterborough. So he worked for them until his retirement. My mother stayed home with the children until I was, once again, probably 8 or 9. Then I used to have lunch at school and come home about the same time as my mother. So everything was
Did
fine.
they encourage your education? Was that a big deal, or were they just trying to keep their head above water?
I think it was pretty much, in those days, it was, can we keep them alive? It was, education was not foremost in their mind. However, my father always wanted more for me because of the fact that they had not very much when they were growing up. Mm-hmm. So then, after I left school, I applied. My father, I had an interest in mechanics. On the weekend, I would go to the local train station and watch trains all day and, tear motorcycles apart and goodness knows what else. So I had a great love for mechanical things. So my father wanted to encourage me to be a mechanical engineer. So, okay, I don't have any better ideas. So I applied for an apprenticeship at Perkins Engines, and they would issue maybe 5 or 6 apprenticeships, and they might be 50 or 60 people apply for them from all walks of life. So I took this and figured, well, after I'd taken the exam and goodness knows what else, I thought I'd better intercept the postman before my father gets the results of this exam. Much to his delight and my surprise, I was admitted into this apprenticeship program. So,
how old were you at the time?
At the time I was 15.
Okay.
Wow. The apprenticeship
Yeah.
program, pretty much you went to a technical college for 2 to 3 days a week and then applied it in practical application for the company that was paying for you to do this. So that's pretty much and what happened when you're 15 and you go into one of these programs, at about age 21, you come out with what they call a City and Guilds certificate, which is basically the same as a bachelor's degree in engineering. So anyway, I was doing this, and at about the age of 17 and a half, I was thinking, I really don't want to do this. And so, and I couldn't see any prospects beyond that in England at that time, actually. Although England in the early 60s was a great place to have fun, it was not a great place to look at the future. So my sister, the middle sister, the one that's 11 years older than me, married an American who was stationed at an Air Force base close by when she was about 20 years old. Went off to America, and in those days nobody had telephones or anything else, so you corresponded through letters. So my sister and I used to write to each other, and she said, if you ever think of coming to America, you're more than happy to stay with us. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound like too bad of an idea. So I went off to the American Embassy to apply for a visa, and they said, what kind would you like? What kind do you have? He said, well, we have temporary visitor's visa where you can stay in the country for 6 months, but you can't work. Or we have a permanent visa. In those days, it was very easy to get a visa into the US if you were English. Each country had its own quotas. For instance, the Irish and the Italians filled their quotas quite a bit. The English didn't. So all I had to do was jump through 2 more hoops, fill out some paperwork, and I had a permanent visa, which allowed me to get a green card.
So how old were you at
So
this time?
I was about a couple of months short of my 18th birthday. So I did my parents a favor and left home and left the country at the same time. So, so anyway, I arrive in the United States, and so before I could go to school or apply to college or anything like that in the US, I had to have these varying subjects like civics, economics, so on and so forth, to get you into college on a, you know,
Right.
on some kind of a program.
Yeah.
So I went to high school. The town that I moved to was a town called Ecorse in Michigan. It was pretty much a steel town, working class town. And so I went off to high school, and I went to school during the day, and I got a job as a laborer in the steel mill at night. So I used to go to school, work the night shift, then get off and go to school, and then come home and
Gosh.
sleep a little bit and mess around. So I did this while I was in high school. So I do this for a year. So along comes 1965. So now I apply to Eastern Michigan University, but they can't take you until the next semester. Well, between then and the next semester, I get a draft notice from the US government.
Oh.
And I thought, well, you know, they can't draft me, I'm English.
Yeah. You already
And besides, I know nothing about the military, they don't draft in England. So I go down to the draft board, and yes, you're 1A, and we'd like to invite you to come back, and you'll be drafted on January the 10th. So I go back on January the 10th, 1966. And there were about 60 to 80 guys in line, straight line, all in alphabetical order. And they said, congratulations, the Marine Corps started drafting today. We're taking the first 16 to the Marines. So I didn't know the Marine Corps from the Boy Scouts. I'll interject a little funny story here. So I'm standing next
Yeah,
to this.
please do. This is 1966 is not a good time to be entering the U.S.
No, it isn't. It isn't. Believe me, it isn't. So I'm standing next to the only person that I know in this line of 80 people is a guy I know, standing right next to me. My name's Green, his was Heskett, so alphabetically we're next to each other. So of these 16 guys who were drafted into the Marines, they're all screaming, I don't want to go in the Marine Corps, I don't want to go in the Marine Corps. So I turned to my friend and I said, why don't they want to go in the Marine Corps? He said, well, my father was in the Army in the Second World War, and the stories he tells, he says, you don't want to be in the Army, it's really tough. I said, well, what's the Marine Corps like? Talk about babes in the woods. So anyway, he said, have you ever seen those billboards with the guy with the sword and the white hat and the blue uniform? I said, yes. He said, they give you all that stuff and they stick you in front of an embassy. I said, this sounds great. Needless to say, I never saw an embassy, a white hat, a blue uniform, or a sword. So anyway, now I'm sent off to Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, which was the good news out of it all. This was my introduction to California. You know, I went from England to Michigan, which my body wasn't really fond of, and then it saw San Diego, and it quite liked it. So anyway, I go to do my basic training there, go infantry training at Camp Pendleton, and then shipped off to Camp Lejeune, then back to Okinawa, and then from Okinawa to Vietnam in the late '67.
Oh,
So,
God, you think you're going to college and 6 months later?
well, you know, I always had this kind of, shall we say, wanderlust when I was a child. I always wanted to get into some kind of mischief, and I always had some kind of a feeling of adventure. But this was a little more than I had in mind.
This is a little over the edge when it comes
Yes, it was.
to
And you see, also, my parents who were in England, I mean, that was French Indochina when I took geography, and I'm sure it was when they took geography. I mean, I didn't know what the Marine Corps was, and I didn't know where Vietnam was. That was French Indochina. So So anyway, they would write to me, and my mailbox would be FPO San Francisco. So my parents would, because they would send the mail to San Francisco and then send the mail wherever you are. And they would often write and say, how do you like it in San Francisco? I said, it's very nice. Actually, I'd never set foot in San Francisco, but you know, they were in a small town in England, no point in getting them involved. So anyway, let's see what happens next. So now,
How long
yes.
are you in Vietnam, and are you in combat, or what's the?
No, I was a truck mechanic. I was
kept up your mechanical.
I think I must have been one of the only people in the Marine Corps. They actually did apply what you knew to your job, but so yeah, pretty much a mechanic. But the thing with being a Marine, they put you wherever you want to. There was a friend of mine who was a truck mechanic, and he ended up being a machine gunner on a helicopter. So it depended upon where you were and what they needed. But I was fine.
So how long you were in Vietnam for a year, 13?
No. I went to from Camp Lejeune to Okinawa. I was supposed to go from Camp Lejeune to Vietnam, but they took about half a dozen of us off the plane and left us in Okinawa, which was fine with me. So I was on Okinawa from about October, November of '66 to about towards the end of summer '67, then went to Vietnam late '67 and late summer '67, and came home like October, November of '67, and then came back, and I had a couple of months left. And the good news about being drafted into the Marine Corps, everybody else was in for 4 years. There was a little group of us that were only in for 2. Because we were draftees, so that was good. They could only send you over there once.
Wow.
So.
Wow, could have been much worse. So now you're back in San Diego.
So now I'm back in San Diego, and now I'm back in. Then I go back to Detroit. One of the rules was back in those days. If whatever job you leave, they have to guarantee it for you when you get back. Well, I was a laborer in a steel mill, so I got that fine job as a laborer in the steel mill back, and started college. So actually, during my college, I worked full time at the steel mill and took full load in college as well.
Oh my gosh.
So the good news is I came out with no debt and a new house and a college degree.
You were in really good physical shape too, I presume.
Yeah, then. So, and then at the end of, this was beginning of '68 that I got out of the Marine Corps. So I met my wife on my last leave, and then a year later, in November of '68, we were married. She's from England also. She came over as an au pair when she was 18 years old. So we ran into each other in Detroit, of all places, dating capital of America. So so then.
You graduated from Eastern Michigan University?
I did, yes.
In what subject?
Business, yeah.
Okay.
So I worked at the steel mill on the midnight shift, and when I went to college, I had to figure out what I wanted to do, and my thought was I want to do anything where you don't have to work at night. So I went into accounting and finance. So I got out of college with a finance degree, and so I applied at Ford Motor Company, which then in that area was a pretty, good job to have. So I applied, and they put me on a management training program. So I did that from '74 to '76. I did that. I was, I think, a cost analyst at that time. Mm-hmm. And then in '76, in May of '76, I came out of work and my car was covered in snow, and I came home to my wife and I said, people are not designed to live in climates where it snows in May. So she said, well, what should we do? I said, well, when I was in San Diego, it was pretty nice there. So she said, so what are we going to do? I said, why don't we just go to California? So we stuck a for sale sign in the lawn. 5 days later, the house sold. 6 weeks later, we threw everything we owned in the back of a U-Haul truck and drove to California. That was it.
Wow.
So
A lot of people came to California because of their having passed through there on the in the service.
it's true. And one of the towns that I I hopped on a bus and went down the coast to look at small towns, and I ran into Laguna Beach, which I thought was just absolute paradise. I thought, well, okay, I'm going to live here one day. So we did. I thought, well, if we don't have a job, I might as well live where I want to live and then look for a job. So, so I then got a job at Ford Aerospace in Newport Beach as a financial analyst. I worked for them for a couple of years, and it was during the Jimmy Carter era, and it was they made weaponry for the US government. It was a government contractor. So under the Carter era, we had, 15, 18% inflation, and also a freeze on anyone who worked for a government contractor. So with no raise in pay and an 18% interest, this was a way to get poor real fast. So I thought, I'll go and look for another job. So I found a job at a company called C.E. Miller. It was a kind of a startup company in the oil and gas industry. It used to make gas compression modules, which basically compresses gas, shoots it down into the wells and forces the oil back up, and also acts as a storage for the natural gas. So I worked for C.E. Miller and as assistant controller at that point.
It's still in Southern California there.
Still in Southern California. This is in Irvine. Ford Aerospace was in Newport Beach. C.E. Miller was in Irvine.
Right.
So I went, let's see, to C.E. Miller, was then acquired by a company called KTI, Kinetics Technology International. There was a Dutch-based oil company on an acquisition binge in the US. So they acquired C.E. Miller. Another company they acquired was a small company called Cascade Graphics Development, started by a gentleman named Dan Johnson. And they were actually one of the first to put software on a desktop computer. The only problem was they did it as a standalone unit. They would put the software into the hardware and sell a standalone unit, which is fine if you're Intergraph and you're selling machines for $300,000, but if you're selling a pretty much PC with CAD on it, that's not a way to stay in business. So
Can I interrupt you before you progress? And that is, you're going through all of these steps, all financial analysts, similar kinds of jobs. Is that what you envisioned for the future? Did you have other ideas about what you'd like to get to in the future? Or is anybody giving you advice, or you just sort of
no advice at all. The only one advice I did get was from a supervisor I had at Ford Aerospace, and I noticed that he spent most of his time buying and selling houses than he did actually working. And one day he said to me, "Al, you'll never get rich through salary. You need to do it through capital gains." So I thought, okay. So I thought, well, if I'm going to get another job next time, we need to go the capital gains route, not the salary route. So, but that came later. I'm still on the salary route at C.E. Miller and Cascade Graphics. So with Cascade Graphics, I'm now, the title I believe was financial director. Wasn't a very big company, hardly anybody there, but I was financial director. So one day, Dan Johnson leaves. Now I liked him. He was a great guy, great entrepreneur, nice guy. So he left, and they put another person in, a CEO in the company. I wasn't really too keen on the whole situation there at that point. And one day I was sitting at my desk, phone rang, and Dan Drake from Autodesk called, and he said, you know, this would have been about fall of 83. And he said, you know, he gave me a background on how they'd started Autodesk, and they were looking for a finance person, and that I'd been recommended to them. Little did I know until years later that it was actually Dan Johnson, who I worked for at Cascade Graphics, that met them at a Comdex show and said, you know, if you need a financial guy, this is the guy to call. So
I was wondering, how the heck did they make that connection?
how do you, yeah, right. So he was at Comdex. I think he must have been 83. Comdex of 83. So they called me in the fall of, Dan calls me in the fall of 83. It was, we're looking for a finance guy. We don't have any money. You'll have to move yourself up here, and we could be out of business in 6 months, but we'll give you a bunch of worthless stock. How could you ever turn an offer like that down? So I told my wife, and she said, tell me you didn't say yes. I said, well, look, I said, I hate what I'm doing, and I'm going to change my job anyway. Why don't we give this, you know, a flyer for 6 months and see what happens? So she stayed in the house in Laguna Beach. And
you really weren't happy where you were.
No, I was not happy where I was.
The path you were on was not a good one.
No. So, so my wife stayed in the house in Laguna Beach, and I moved up to the offices at that time. Some were in Mill Valley, and some were in Sausalito. Let's see. So I come up to the interview, and I interview with Dan Drake, John Walker, Mike Ford, and Keith Marcelius at that time. And it was an empty room with 4 metal folding chairs in one line and one facing it. So I figured I must be the one. I got there first. So, so anyway, they show up. It was a beautiful day in Laguna Beach, and it was pouring with rain in Mill Valley, and I thought, what am I doing here? But after about...
At least it wasn't snowing.
It wasn't snowing. And after about 15 minutes, I thought, I think the link was with the CAD that Cascade Graphics had. You were not going to get anywhere bundling it with hardware. And these guys, that's exactly what they felt. This is a software company. We don't want to touch hardware. And so I think there was something that synced there. And after about 15 minutes, I thought, these are some very bright people. So I agreed to join them, and joined them in, I think, the spring of 84. So I moved up here and stayed in a one room at the Best Western Hotel in Corte Madera for which inspired you to spend a lot of time at work. So I stayed there, and I would go down to Laguna Beach on the weekend. One weekend, then my wife would come up from Laguna Beach the following weekend, and that's kind of how we did it. After about three to 4 months, it was pretty obvious that this was going to make it. So Elaine sold a house in Southern California and moved up, and we got an apartment in Sausalito in 84.
Moving from Laguna Beach to Sausalito is two nice places to be.
They are nice places to be. Yeah. So far so good. So let's see.
So tell me, I mean, what's the state of the company at this time? I mean, I think in 80. So you came up in 84, huh? And so the company was only doing like $1 million a year, but growing very rapidly.
Yes, exactly. I'm not sure what you know about the company so far, but basically when John wrote a letter to about 20, stop me if this has already been repeated and you can edit it out if you want to, but John wrote a letter to about 20 people that he had worked with or knew had business contacts in the past that he thought were bright people, and mentioned to them that the 1980s is going to be the decade of application software for this new thing called the personal computer, and what we need to do is develop 5 software packages, and based on the 80-20 rule, 4 will fail and 1 will succeed. The one they thought would succeed was a product called Autodesk, which was kind of a software version of Apple Lisa at that time. So that's where the founders came in, and then
I did get history on the company, which was really, I mean, I've been involved in startups myself, and this is a bizarre way to start a startup. This collective of programmers, and let's
I know,
throw a bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks, right?
And believe me, I tell you what, it was just up my alley, though. I mean, I just loved that environment. And in fact, the most fun I ever had at Autodesk was in the early days. When you're working hard and scrambling, it's when it becomes a real corporation. You've got things going on you never ever wanted to be involved in. Lawyers and goodness knows what else. So anyway.
So John Walker seems to be quite a character in one form or another. I mean, unusual guy. In some ways, totally not a leader, but in other ways, a very natural leader. Tell me.
Yes, look, here's the thing. John is probably, even to this day, the brightest guy I've ever run across. I mean, whatever he applied himself to, he would be the best at it. I mean, I came into Autodesk as chief financial officer, went up to VP of finance, and then became CEO. John would have made a better VP of finance than me and a much better CEO than me. He just had that ability. He was an incredibly bright guy. It's...
Well, that's the kind of people you want to associate with.
It was, and that was fun.
So what about the other, Drake and the other founders that you had interviewed with? Did they all get along with each other? Was this a family? Was there a lot of contention? In the early days, when you first started, what was the?
No, there was no contention. I mean, it was. It would have been like I wouldn't say a close family, but it was a group of people that got along well, and so no, there was actually no.
It always struck me that, here each one of them came in with their own project, their own program or whatever they'd written.
Right.
And for them to all abandon something and sort of go to what was the winner, it just didn't seem like a natural act, but it sounds like it worked very well in that environment.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I agree.
So as I say, okay, so when you came in, it was growing so fast, it's hard to kind of pin down what it was at the moment you came in, but I mean, it was in the process of going from 1 million to 10 million to millions, right? And over the period in which you were there.
Yeah, so I come to work the first day, and my first day on the job was in Europe. I went to visit they had a lady there who was a controller, and they had an accountant. That basically comprised the finance department. So I was the CFO of a 2-person department. So we went off to Europe, and this is when I met Richard Handyside. These guys were all founders too. They met John through Marinchip. So Richard Handyside was in London, Rudolf Künzli was in Switzerland, and Lars Moreau was in Sweden. And they acted as, in the beginning, distributors of of John's marine chip product, and then as Autodesk came along, they became distributors of the AutoCAD product. We needed to, at some point, make them into wholly owned subsidiaries of Autodesk, and that was that initial thing that I was doing there.
Just as a sidelight, was this your first time back to England since you had left at age 15?
No, I had been back before, but only. I went back in 1985. I left in 84, came to the US, went back in 85 to see if I really missed England or not. And after I went back to my parents for a month, and after about 2 weeks, I was ready to come back to the United States.
In 85, you were already at Autodesk.
I'm sorry. I've got myself 20 years ahead. In 65. Yeah, so it came in 64. I went back in 65, realized I did want to live in America. Yeah, I just lost 20 years. So no, that was not my. So when I came back to the U.S. On the European trip, I noticed that it was brought to my attention that the two people in accounting were misappropriating funds, shall we say, and so we had to dismiss them. And so now I'm the CFO of a no-person department. So me in charge of accounting is a very scary thought. So.
Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. So you came from fairly large companies in the past where there was a lot of structure and jobs were fairly well defined, I presume.
Yes.
Now you're thrown into a situation where you're responsible for everything in a startup, which is totally different than the kind of companies you come from.
Which I loved, because what I learned more in managing a company was from looking at all the companies I'd worked for and how they managed to demotivate people. And I thought, I wonder if you actually reverse that. Can you actually motivate people? And lo and behold. So anyway, I think also I think with John, Dan, and myself, that's also something we had in common was rather than giving lip service to people being your most valuable asset, they actually are your most valuable asset, and you treat them that way. So everyone, later on, everyone was issued Autodesk stock. It was distributed pretty horizontally. So let's see, where are we?
That was also a whole new thing. I mean, the issue of stock distribution, and you'd never been involved in that before either. Is that correct?
No, because I worked for the pretty typical type company where the CEO rolled up in his corporate Mercedes-Benz parked right in front of the office, and they're the ones who scarfed up all the good stuff. And so I thought maybe if you distribute the good stuff to the people who are actually doing the job, if you can actually get more production out of them. And
so was there anybody to sort of mentor you or guide you in all of this or help you make decisions, or you just sort of went seat of the pants? This is what I think.
Pretty much. Yeah, that was it. So then we didn't have a lot of cash, and we were starting to grow at a pretty good rate. So we needed to hire people. We needed facilities. The facilities were really stretched, and so I went to the local bank and asked for a $10 million unsecured line of credit with no personal guarantees. And the guy looked at me.
I said, how does that go?
Well, actually, amazingly enough, he gave it to me. So I said, look, here's the thing. You give me the $10 million and we will run all of our funds through your bank. Well, we didn't have very many funds then. But later on, we had a huge amount of funds, and he was very happy he did. And to go along with that story, we never did tap into the $10 million line of credit.
Was that right?
Yeah. So we never had any debt in the company, and so we needed money. So John and I went off to. There was a financial conference in Monterey, and basically companies would get up and would do a dog and pony show, and most of the companies would be there for their 10th round of financing because they'd already blown through the other 9. So we get up and we show them the growth path we're on, and we start to get some attention. but the attention, we were looking for an influx of capital, but a lot of the problems were not so much financial, but philosophical. The people who were looking at Autodesk were trying to pigeonhole you into a pigeonhole that looked a lot like all the ones other failing companies had been in. So there was a gentleman by the name of Jim Marver who worked for L.F. Rothschild at that time, and he came up to me and said, you know, Al, you might, on this track, you might want to think of taking it public. So anyway, I ran this by the people at Autodesk, and it didn't go over real well, shall we say. And, and yes, it would have been much better to have not been a public company. Being a public company is a real pain in the neck. However, it does give you a lot of capital, and we needed a lot of capital. I mean, just for the growth of the company. And it allowed us to hire people, it allowed us to get new facilities, and so John and I went off and did our dog and pony show on the road show for the initial public offering.
So when was that, and how did that?
That would have been 1985. So we started the whole process probably around the end of '84, getting together. We hired Larry Sancini. Well, actually, they were just starting up at that time too. And so Larry Sancini came and visited us in our very small offices, and he was pretty entrepreneurial too at that time. And basically, it was, I'll give you a cut rate on legal fees, but if you do go public and once you become successful, you have us as your attorneys. So I said, sounds like a good idea. So we did. And they represented us during the public offering. We had Arthur Young as accountants and L.F. Rothschild as the lead underwriter, and I believe Alex Brown was the secondary on the offering. And
so the company went public in 86?
85. Yeah, 85.
And so tell me, what was when you came in, was there a strategy, or it was just, well, we're going to continue to do this and we're just going to work hard at it? Was the idea of a vision or anything like that, or is it just, let's just sell as much software as we can?
I remember Mike Ford, who was head of marketing at that time, and he said to us one day, he said, we've got an opportunity here. It's like this green field full of gold bars, and all we have is a pickup truck. We've got to get all those gold bars into the back of the pickup truck before they come with bulldozers. And that was, and so that was kind of a strategy, I suppose. Now, technically, yes, there was a strategy. I mean, for AutoCAD and the development of AutoCAD, there was a strategy, and that was carried out pretty much by Dan, John, and the technical part. So what happened then was, at this point, I think I was VP of Finance, and it became, so there was John and Dan taking care of the technical aspects, and I would be taking care of the other stuff. Mm-hmm. So it became, if it wasn't technical, then it must be Al's. So that was basically how that came along. And so along comes 1986. And John comes to Dan and I, and he said, look, I don't want to be CEO anymore. I hate this stuff. It's taking up way too much of my time. I'm a very productive programmer, and I need to be spending my time programming. So one of you guys is going to have to be CEO. So it was a real power struggle. So I look at Dan and I said, I don't want to be CEO. And he looks at me and he said, I don't want to be CEO. And then Dan looks at me and he said, but I can program. And then John kindly said, well, look, Al, he said, you've built the company, you might as well run it. So that was how that all came about.
So what do you think your major contributions, in that sort of first 2 or 3 years? So tell me what you think your major contributions were in kind of getting it ready to go public.
Well, that's a that's a tough one. I've never really thought of that. Basically, my concentration was on making it a stable, financially successful company, building it up, getting the facilities in order, getting the employees in order, the right employees in the right areas, so that when we went public, it did look like, a real company. And
so did you had responsibility for basically everything but the technical stuff? I mean, in terms of your
that
management?
is correct. Now, at that time, I think Mike Ford had, when John came to me and Dan, Mike Ford had already left, and there was a new fellow, Tony Monaco, I think was his name, who came in as the marketing person. So pretty much well, then I would have been CEO at that time anyway, so I would have been overlooking marketing at that time anyway. But pretty much, yes, prior to all of that, if it wasn't technical, then I took care of it. Whether it was accounting, whether it was facilities, whether it was, I can remember one lady comes one day and says, "Well, I'm pregnant. What's your maternity leave policy?" I said, "Well, we don't have one. What do you think it should be?" So that, so then you sit down and make one up. And Dan, I think I went to him with this, and he said, "Look," he said, "we don't have policies and procedures, and I hate them." And I said, "Me too." He said, "So what we'll do, if we make up policies and procedures, they have to be on one half of one side of a sheet of paper. If it's any larger than that, we don't have it." So that was pretty much how we went. So it was, each time we came into a situation, we looked at it reasonably. And
so again, I'm going to come back to the issue of, you were on a very rapid growth trajectory. I mean, during your
right.
time there, you were multiplied by 10 or 100, or, I mean.
Right.
So growth, that rapid of growth, I mean, requires capital, as you had indicated.
Right.
But there are regular strains on the organization in terms of how you organize and who does what and levels of responsibility and all of that. I mean, what were the failure?
And that was probably, looking back, some of the things I would have done much differently. The company's grows, so you manage the growth, then all of a sudden it starts to really pick up speed and grow at a rapid rate. So you need to put different people in different responsibilities, but you don't have time to do it. So I would start assigning, look, we need to fill these vacancies here, we need to get something put in over here, so I would assign that to someone. And the problem is, once you then start delegating, I don't know, maybe I like to have too much control, but it just got to the point where we started to get people into spots that if I had it do over again, I'm not sure I would have done that. And that also comes with things you learn. In the early days of the company, the board of directors consisted of myself, John Walker, Dan Drake, Greg Lutz, and Mike Ford. You'd have your meeting. They're there all the time. Fully understand marketing, fully understand finances, fully understand the technical. Everything was fine. You came out of a meeting, you had a plan, everything was great. Okay, once you become a public company, and I understand why, but they say, well, you must have outside members on your board of directors. So now you have to get. And one thing I did, I signed that job. I said, look, to this one guy, I said, look, I'm up to my neck here. You go out and find some members for the board of directors. So I think he had been to Harvard for 20 minutes and belonged to the Harvard business whatever, and came up with two guys who went who belonged to the Harvard Business Club or whatever. And so now you're piling this on top of a bunch of people who are renegades, shall we say. And it doesn't really work that well. And so now you've got boards of directors of people who were in, yes, they may have been successful in their industries, but those industries had nothing to do with what we were doing. They show up, one day a month, they have their donuts and coffee and get their check, and there isn't a lot of value added. I don't know how you correct it. The value added was when we all were on the board of directors and we knew it and we had the responsibility. But then you start diluting it. And then, of course, John leaves the board of directors and Dan leaves the board of directors, and then pretty soon, I'm in there with the board of directors.
So was the corporate legal guy, right? Did he have?
They were the outside attorneys. We had a person in the legal department. Chris Record was our first in-house attorney, and he later left, and that job went to a lady called Sandy Marin. I was busily trying to get Marcia Sterling from Larry Sancini's office. I would have loved to have had her in there, but she kept turning me down, and the rascal went and jumped on board when Carol Bartz came along.
Marcia Sterling. I know Marcia Sterling. She worked with our company as well, VLSI Technology.
Yeah, she's a great lady. I loved her. She was just perfect for the job, but she wouldn't take it. But anyway.
So you were just trying to sort of keep this ship sailing in the right direction with very rapid growth and
yes,
board of directors that wasn't adding a lot of value and so forth. Did you continue? I mean, did you stay on good terms with the founders? I guess several of the founders left. You said Mike Ford left.
Yeah.
How did that? How did it evolve with the founders? Did they leave because they were bored? They made their money and it's time to do something else. They didn't want a big company.
Well, some of the founders didn't come into the office hardly at all from the very beginning, and we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 of them. The other founders, Richard Handyside, Rudolph, Laws, they were all heading up subsidiaries. They were fine. They were doing their job. They were all very bright people and turned those subs into great organizations. As far as Greg Lutz, for instance, he stayed. He was stayed in the technical department. Dan stayed in the technical department. Later on, John, once he wasn't CEO, he would work more from home and then come back to the office probably in the evening time. And Dan, he started working more from his home in Mill Valley. But let's see, other like Maury and Dave, they all were there in the technical department and stayed there. So yes, I mean they all
on board and continued doing what they were doing.
Yeah.
And Mike Ford, he had left for.
He left in '86, and so he was replaced by Tony Monaco, and that was it.
Yeah. So, what would you say the biggest? Obviously, growth sounds like the number one challenge, but sort of what would you categorize as the 1 or 2 other sort of major challenges you had to deal with during your CEO? During the time when you were CEO? There are legal issues with their,
you constantly
strategy and.
Not so much conflicts with strategy. You would have, I wouldn't call them conflicts. You may have a disagreement, but they were resolved pretty quickly. There were no major issues as far as conflicts of interest in what the product should be or what we were doing, any of that direction. Like I said, if I were to do it over again, I think I would have staffed it a little more heavily on the top. Maybe I should have gotten a COO and let them take some more of the the burden. So no, there were the other issues as you become a larger company is, especially when you become an international company. When you're a small company and you're starting up, everybody goes home at night, and at night they're sleeping. When you have an international corporation, somebody is screwing up somewhere in the world 24 hours a day. And so you don't know what they're going to present you, but they will present you with something. You go home at night and you think everything's fine. You come back in the morning and, well, you know, we got this going on in Russia. We got this thing going on in Austria. So that would be challenging. The other thing, too, is when you're a startup company and you have no money, you're of no interest to the lawyers at all. You start to get money and, boy, I had more shareholder lawsuits thrown at us than, you know, you can shake a stick at. And that's basically, if your stock goes down, there would be companies that would own stocks of various technology companies. If it dropped X number of dollars, they'd automatically kick out a shareholder lawsuit. They knew that it would cost you about $5 million to defend yourself against it, so they would often kindly settle for $4 million. So it was pretty much that kind of thing. This is... It's the normal thing, but it's the stuff that, and then you get mainly the analysts. I would say 90% of them were good and fully understood what they were doing. You get 10% who had absolutely no clue what you were doing, and then you would have journalists who would come in to write articles about the company, and they already had their article already written in their head. All they wanted you to do was just sign off on it, and most of it wasn't true anyway. So I wasn't really fond of the media or a lot of attorneys. However, that's I think that's just the most CEOs would say pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. How were decisions made about sort of technical direction? Was that mainly done by John, or somebody else came in to sort of head up the R&D? Tell me a little bit about sort of how you manage the R&D side of things and how that evolved, how the strategy for that evolved.
We had a person come in, the head of R&D, but basically, when I took the job of CEO, I turned to Dan and I said, look, I don't really want to do this, you don't want to do this, but if I do this, you know, will you keep an eye on the technical stuff? And he said, yes. So pretty much the technical direction, and it was throughout the company, was directed by John and Dan. We had a head of R&D, and that was pretty much a day-to-day management of the technical staff, but the major strategies really came from John, Dan, Greg, and that would be the direction.
So when the question came up, you know, should we pursue this new program or should we buy this, company or whatever, from a technical point of view, they would sort of make their recommendations and you would all kind of sign off on it? Is that sort of
That's correct. I mean, for instance, an example would be when Steve Jobs came out with his, he left Apple and came out with his Next product. Yeah. And he called me up and I went down there and he was trying to convince me that AutoCAD should run on Next. Well, they didn't have, Next wasn't a widely distributed platform, you know, and so, you know, do we really want to write for something that really isn't going to sell too many things? But, you know, Steve, he's pretty convincing. So I said, look, here's the deal. If you can convince our technical staff to write a product for your product, a product for your machine, then I'll consider it. So what we did, we set up a meeting in the Marin Civic Center. Steve Jobs got on the stage and we had the whole technical department in there and a few other people who wanted to come and watch. And he gave a speech on why he thought we should put AutoCAD on Next, and it got shot down. So we didn't. Really what I was trying to do, and as a side negotiation, I was trying to get Alvy Ray Smith out of his contract with Pixar and bring him over to Autodesk. But that was my motivation.
Yeah, Alvar Ray Smith is quite a guy. I've met him a few
Yes, he is.
times. Yeah, that would have been an interesting addition to the
Yes, it would.
Group. So were there, so you ended up departing CEO as 1992.
92.
What led up to that, and sort of what are the confluence of events that made for that change?
Well, there were a few things going on at that time. First of all, from a personal standpoint, I was getting to where, like I said, the most fun I had with that company was in the early days when you're building a company and you're building a product. As it gets larger, it becomes more political, a little more bureaucratic, less fun, and you're more of a fireman than you are a CEO. You have that, plus, John had concerns with the direction of the company, and but that's a question you'll have to ask John. Well,
actually, I mean, from what you describe, sounded like from a technical point of view, a product point of view, there were others who were sort of making those recommendations and choices that you were not from the beginning sort of directly involved in. Kind of, I mean, obviously you had to buy in and so forth, had to make sense, but you were not the technical leader from the beginning.
That is correct, yes.
So he had some concerns. I mean, was there anything that you were doing that kept them from doing, from going the direction he thought, or is it needed leadership from the CEO level to sort of make the changes, or what was he looking for?
I'm not sure it was so much that, but I think as the company got larger and it became more political, you now have John, who's moved to Switzerland, and Dan for a great amount of time was at home in Mill Valley. So people who had issues would either bring them to Dan's attention or to John's attention, and then John would bring them to Dan's attention. And I think it got to the point where John wanted to go to Switzerland and do what John does best. And all of this political stuff, I believe, is exactly the kind of stuff that John hates. So it was turning into a little bit of a political cesspool there, and I think John just threw a hand grenade in the cesspool. And that's what happened. And the problem is, when you're the CEO, you're the one standing closest to the cesspool. But it was interesting to see, as the hand grenade went into the cesspool, who ran for the hills. The outside directors, I believe, were the first ones. They didn't want splattering.
I was in doing the research. There was a fellow, Mark Stiegler, who was VP of R&D at that time. Does that ring a bell?
No. McElhaney, I believe, was VP of R&D, and then he left. I don't remember who came in after that. It might have been.
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Yeah. This is a memory test for old people. This
really things got messy. So at some point you decided, okay, it's time for me to step aside. Was that late 91? Is that?
It would have been, yes. And so I gave my resignation and stayed on until they found a replacement, which was Carol Bartz.
And who spearheaded that CEO search? Did you have an outside recruiting firm, or
we did, and I can't remember the name. I'm thinking it's Heinrich and Struggles or something like.
Yeah,
I think they were.
One.
Yeah.
And were there a lot of other candidates? Was there controversy about Carol Bartz being chosen? Was there competition? Somebody else almost made it, or what's the?
There were a few people that were eliminated right away. I think it came down to Carol Bartz, and there was one other fellow, and I would know the name if I heard it, but it slips my mind right now. I can't remember who it was. But he was.
I mean, technically, it's a board of directors that makes this decision.
Correct.
But I mean, John Walker was not on that board at the time, right? So
that is correct. But
so how did this? Who really made the decision? What?
Well, yeah. So yes, the board of directors makes the decision on who's going to be CEO. But John had a huge amount of influence over the board of directors.
Mm-hmm. And was John Walker fully on board with that? And was he a prime recommender of that, or what was his position?
I don't think he recommended that Carol Bartz should be CEO. I mean, he went along with who the board of directors chose, and I think the people who interviewed them included me, was Dan, Greg, John, the outside members of the board of directors, but he left it entirely the decision up to the board of directors. So John wasn't influential in who became the next CEO. Right.
So he wasn't really trying to insert himself in that.
No, he was not. He was not.
Okay. So what was the overall state of the company as you were leaving? What were there? I mean, I think it grew by like a factor of 10 under your stewardship. Is that?
Yes. I mean, so when I joined, let me see, I got a little thing here off on the side. Still. So anyway, so along the way, we opened up a subsidiary in Japan. We put in $2 million into that organization. It became, I believe it was the most profitable software company in Japan after just a $2 million investment. We opened up offices in the Soviet Union and in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe out of our Swiss subsidiary. They grew. We would keep the capital in those subsidiaries to grow those subsidiaries. We didn't take the proceeds back into the U.S. So we did a lot of expansion in those areas. We set up the new international headquarters in Neuchâtel. So when I left, we had, with Autodesk as a software as CAD, we had about an 80% market share. We had a market cap of about close to $2 billion. We never had, ever since we went public, we never had a down quarter. Every quarter was progressively better. And we never had any debt, never tapped into our line of credit. And also we had never had any venture capital. And we were, I think, the 4th or 5th largest software company in the world at that time. So, joining a company when it was about $1 million in sales and scattered around Mill Valley and Sausalito, I'm perfectly fine with the results.
Well, yeah, it's a spectacular story of success in an area where lots of companies attempted, but few, if any, grew to the size that Autodesk was able to achieve. You must have spent a lot of your time on the road at conferences, financial conferences, those sorts of things.
I did, but I tried to avoid it wherever possible. That is, if it was beneficial to the company, I would do it. But a lot of times, brokerage firms will want you to come and put on a presentation for their customers in New York or something else, and I
Yeah.
just hated that stuff. It was, I felt it was more promoting the CEO than the company. If it was promoting the company, I didn't mind it, but if it was promoting the CEO, I just didn't like that stuff at all.
Mhm.
And yeah.
So was there any question at the time when you were going to step down as there being an internal candidate? Was there anybody that you considered internally, or was it obvious to everybody that you were going to go outside?
Well, we were going to go outside. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, there was no internal candidates.
Okay. How involved did you get in the CAD industry itself, in terms of the other companies? What about, I guess one thing we didn't really talk about was competition. You said you had, the vast market share. Who did you perceive as competition, or what was the?
Well, in the very early days, it would have been, there was a product called PCAD, I believe, and another one called VersaCAD. And they were probably the closest things to, there were quite a few out there, but they were probably the closest to competition. And then, of course, there were the big ones. There was, at that time, Intergraph, McDonnell Douglas, you name. There was all kinds of people had CAD programs that were for sale, but they were more standalone mainframe types rather than desktop. Desktop would have been PCAD and VersaCAD, I guess, would be the ones that popped to mind.
Did any of those larger companies, the Intergraphs or others, did they come calling to ask about a purchase or acquisition?
What's absolutely amazing, and this is part of why I wanted to take the company public. I thought, I think what was happening, they were looking at us as not a real CAD product. It was a desktop software only. It's not a real CAD product. And I thought, as long as we can keep them thinking that, we need to keep them thinking that, because we don't have the capital. All we need is Microsoft to decide they want to get into the CAD industry, and they can throw more money at that overnight than we'll probably earn in the next 10 years. So I'm absolutely amazed and delighted, because that's the one thing that just, if something keeps you up at night, that's about it. I expect to wake up in the morning and say, IBM or Microsoft just entered the CAD business, but none of them did, and nobody came calling. Oddly enough, the one company that we looked at who was going to put an investment in Autodesk was McGraw-Hill. At that, of all, and we entertained them, we listened to it, and but what was happening? The perception of AutoCAD or Autodesk was there's this pie, and there's this CAD pie, and you've got IBM, you've got McDonnell Douglas, Intergraph, and then you've got this little sliver in the corner that's called Autodesk. And what was really happening, we weren't in that pie. We had created a whole new pie, and we owned the pie. That was, and nobody was seeing that.
And you were eating all of your pie.
And we were hoping nobody would see the pie. but that was more of the philosophical issue we had. Anybody who was coming in to put venture capital putting capital into the company was trying to pigeonhole you into, the companies that were not really in the same business we were in.
Right. So did you turn down venture capital investments? I mean, was that an option? You said you were looking for cash.
We turned down some. And I think, once again, it was based more on philosophical differences, because we would have loved to have had money. But and also what was very nice, too, is the price of the venture capital. I mean, if they're going to put someone on the board of directors and insert them into this this group that we had, that wouldn't have really worked real well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a very non-traditional company from so many different perspectives.
Oh, it was. It was. I mean, it was quite an experience. It's you don't quite realize it when you're signing up for it, but it certainly gives you a lot of experience out there in the world. That's for sure.
Um, all right, so Carol Bartz comes in. Did you have any ongoing relationship with the company after that? Was
I
that
stayed on the board of directors, I think, for about a year after that, and that was about it. But you know, and what was great with Carol coming in too. I mean, when I joined the company and took over as CEO, it was very much like a family, and you know, so I'm part of the family members, one of the family members. Carol came in and had the great opportunity of not being directly involved with anyone, and could come in and had a blank sheet. I mean, she could pretty much look at the company and arrange it the way she thought it should be arranged. And quite honestly, when I was CEO, I was the CEO of that company at that time, at which I believe was a good thing.
Mhm.
At the next level, I think it needed somebody different. And evidently Carol Bartz was that person, because it certainly did well under her. So
Yeah, she was there for quite some time.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So what, you were there for at least a year afterwards, and she brought in this fresh look. Did that fresh look create a lot of angst? And, you know, this used to be a nice family and now everything's becoming too bureaucratized, or I mean, or other changes, strategy changes, you know, whatever.
Look, yeah, and the way I look at it is things would happen. I say, well, you know, I don't particularly like that. That's not the way I would do it. But that's exactly why I wasn't there. I mean, you know, if I was saying, well, I think you should do it this way, then I should have stayed as CEO. She was the CEO for the company at that time. And whether I agree with what she did or didn't do is irrelevant. I mean, it worked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if she'd gone down in flames, I could have said, oh my goodness, I should have stayed. But no,
Yeah.
I'm glad I went, and I'm glad she came.
So you were still a young man at the time. You were
Yeah.
46 or whatever.
Yes,
when you
I
left.
was.
So
Yes.
what is Al Green post Autodesk?
Well, what's kind of interesting, ever since I was in school in England, I had a paper round in the morning, and then I went to school and I worked in a bakery in the evening. Then I went to school, I worked at the steel mill in the evening. I feel as though, you know, I've had a full-time job since I was 12 years old, in fact 2, and so it was actually quite a relief. But it takes you, you know, a couple of years to kind of shake that off. But what was interesting about that, you now have the wherewithal to start doing the things you want to do, travel, you know. Did a lot of traveling, did a lot of sailing. I did, much to my chagrin, I was on the board of directors of a couple of companies. Hated being on the board of directors company, because I always viewed myself as one of those people who don't really know what's going on, because I'm not there every day. Why should I be imposing my views on somebody who knows what they're doing? Anyway, that introduced me to a couple of people who then I did a little angel investing, and actually did better at that than I did at Autodesk. So who knew?
You want to mention a couple of those companies?
Oh no, it's one of the companies that I did quite well in was a company called Agile Software. I don't know whether you're ever familiar with that.
I know it. I know the CEO, but his name.
Tom Shanahan? Oh no, Tom Shanahan I think he was VP of finance there for a while.
No, he lived in Saratoga. I don't know if the times overlap, but I know he was CEO for quite some time. Knew him through my kid's school.
Yeah. Well, this fellow I was on a board of directors with at a non-mentionable company. He was the one who turned me onto it. Said these guys have a great idea. They need some capital to get going, and so I put some money in. I think it was like 10 cents a share, and it ended up like 200 bucks a share or something.
Or to more.
Yeah. Yeah, at its peak, I think it hit 200. So that was.
So yeah, have you lived in sort of that, Tiburon, Marin County area from
Yes.
your
So
days?
yes, so we rented in Sausalito, my wife and I, when Autodesk was first starting, and actually right across the road. So my whole world revolved around walking from home to work, to the gym, to the store, and back home. So that was Sausalito. We then moved to Tiburon, I think in around 1990-ish. And then once anyway, make a long story short, we moved to the Nevada side of Lake Tahoe there for a while when I sold everything in California for tax issues. And then once we sold that, then I thought, well, I'm retired. What do you do when you're retired? I thought, well, I'll go to Hawaii and play some golf. So I went to Hawaii and learned how to play golf and actually got quite bored and came back. So, so we've been around. So yes, we've spent most of the time here. And the house we currently have, was built in the 50s, and we tore it apart and remodeled it and moved in a couple of years ago.
Well, it looks spectacular from what I can see.
It's a nice place to be locked up during the pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah. So is there any other comments you want to make about Autodesk or your time there, or you think we've covered it? What's your
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I joined the company. It was a great. There were a good group of people. I mean, I got along with them. They were everything was fine. As far as John and Dan, the founders, I mean, they were two of the smartest people I've ever run across. John is certainly unbelievably adaptable to anything, and the bottom line is, without them, I wouldn't have had the opportunity, and so I have no regrets at all.
And under your leadership, it grew by a factor of 10 or more, it seems.
Yeah. So,
sounds like a good relationship.
It was good. And so
we made this less comfortable than you had anticipated coming in, or are you glad that we're winding up here?
Well, no, actually, it was perfectly fine. I think the anticipation was worse than anything else. One thing I absolutely hated doing was going to New York and standing up in front of a group of people and giving speeches. I hated that. But this is much more comfortable doing it from home. I didn't even have to drive to Mountain View, so that's an even an added bonus.
That's the benefit of the pandemic. Before, we absolutely insisted that people come to our studio in Mountain View, and now we said, well, there's no choice. We have to make this other work, and actually worked out quite well. And we've been able to, get people to participate that we might not otherwise be able to. So it's been very beneficial from that point of view.
Great.
So do you ever make it down to the Computer History Museum? Have you ever heard of it before?
I've heard of it, but I haven't been there. But I thought this was going to be my first time. I was looking. My wife and I were actually going to come down and take a look around, but we'll do that when it's and it'd be great to meet you down there too.
Well, it opens up again in September, October timeframe. Don't know exactly when, and I can guarantee you it'll be a worthwhile trip, and one that you'll quite enjoy. People are quite amazed to find such a world-class museum hidden away in Mountain View. It's
great.
Somebody from Washington, D.C. that had come to visit, that it was sort of Smithsonian class, and and on the way out he said better.
Oh, great.
So it's it's a first-class institution. We have a couple of major exhibits, and as well as a bunch of other things. So I strongly encourage you, and if you are going to be down there, please let me know ahead of time, and I'd love to give you a personal tour.
Great, I appreciate it. Well, thanks, Doug.
All right, Al, thank you very much for taking the time. I'm glad it wasn't too painful, and we'll certainly remain in touch and get you the transcript of the recording.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.